This is my presentation on 1.3 cardiovascular system. So first we're going to start off with the functions of the CV system. This is how the CV system helps our body and why it's good for us. First thing it does is nutrients delivery. This is delivery of proteins and glucose around our body, which keeps our body healthy and is good for us. Next thing it can do is waste product removal. This is the removal of CO2 and lactic acid from our bloodstreams and body. This is good as lactic acid can cause damage to our muscles. The next thing it can do is transport oxygen around the body. This is done in the blood with the erythrocytes and the red blood cells. The next thing it does is clotting of scabs and wounds. This is done with the platelets. It forms a scab above the cut or the wounds, which prevents major blood loss. The next thing it does is protection from infection. Now this is done with the white blood cells in the blood. It stops our bodies from becoming seriously infected and diseased. The final thing it does is thermoregulation. This is our body temperature and keeping it stable. This is done by vasoconstriction and vasodilation. It's important to keep a good body temperature as you could become overheated or too cold. It's important to note that the CV system is very important in everyday life. It's the reason we are able to live, to be free from diseases and infection, and also to be able to transport oxygen to our muscles for supporting actions. It's very important. Okay, now we're going to move on to double circulation. This is how the blood moves through our bodies from our lungs to our muscles. This is a small diagram of how it works, simple diagram. This is a more complex diagram of what it moves through. Okay, so first the blood starts at our lungs. So lungs, what lungs does for our blood is oxygenize the blood. So it puts oxygen into the blood, which is needed for the muscles. It then goes from the lungs to the pulmonary vein, and down from there it goes to the left atrium, and then through there it goes through the bicuspid valve. So it goes from the atrium to the bicuspid valve, through there to the left ventricle. All of this is within our heart, so the left atrium, the bicuspid valve, and the left ventricle. Next it moves on to the aortic valve, going back up the heart, and then into the aorta. Then from the aorta it moves to the muscles where diffusion and gas exchange happens, so the blood is used up and then filled with CO2 and the oxygen is taken, making the blood deoxygenated. Then it moves to the systemic vein and down to the vena cava. The inferior goes up and the superior goes down. Next it moves to the right atrium. This is the side where the deoxygenated blood is, through the tricuspid valve and down to the right ventricle towards the veins. It then moves up the pulmonary artery, so the artery away from the heart, and then the atrium receives the blood and it goes back up to the lungs to be filled with oxygen again, to become oxygenated blood. This is the route of blood through the CV system. Okay, next we're going to look at the heart structure and function. That's a diagram of the heart, and another one. So the endocardium is the muscular wall around the heart which allows the movement of contraction. The epicardium covers the heart's outer surface. This is for protection of the heart. Next is the pericardium, which is the membrane lining in the pericardium cavity to give it extra support. The atria or atrium is left of the heart, top of the heart. Left or right is the first filling of the blood when the blood's into the heart. The bicuspid valve is the left side of the heart, which allows oxygenated blood through. And the tricuspid valve is the right side of the heart, which allows deoxygenated blood through. Next is the chordae tendon, which is found at both of the bicuspid and tricuspid valves, which prevents backflow of the blood. Then the papillary muscles, which are the small muscles which anchor down the valves to make sure they're not freely moving, also helps with the chordae tendon keeping its place. Next is the aortic valve. This is the left side of the septum, which allows oxygenated back up and out of the heart towards the muscles. And then the pulmonary valve is the right side of the septum, which is where the deoxygenated blood is allowed up and out of the heart towards the lungs. Okay, next is moving on to the cardiac cycle. The cycle of the heart retracting and relaxing pumps the blood out and around the heart and takes in blood. So it's the whole movement of the heart and the blood coming in and out. So there's little notes to make that contraction is the cardiac muscle movement caused by stimulation, so as our heart pushes. And then relaxation is the resting phase of the heart, which is allowing refill of the heart and rest time. The heartbeat is the pulsation of the heart, so it's the pace and tempo at which your heart is contracting and relaxing. Systole is the contraction phase of the chambers of the heart, so when the heart is contracting and pushing the blood out. Diastole is the relaxation phase of the heart, so where the heart's relaxing and allowing blood to fill it back up. Okay, next we're moving on to the conduction system. This is what stimulates the movement and allows the blood to flow through. So it's the heart's regulating system, made of specialist muscle tissues that cause action potential within the heart. It also causes the heartbeat. So first look at is the SA node. This is the heart's natural pacemaker, which controls the tempo of the heartbeat, and it's found in the left atrium. And then the AV node receives action potential from the SA node, and it's found just above the ventricle. Then we moved on to the bundle branches, which is a series of fibers located just below the AV node. They pass the impulse from the AV node to the Purkinje fibers. The Purkinje fibers located within the myocardium of the ventricles, they complete the ventricle contraction of the heart, so they receive the impulse from the bundle of branches and stimulate blood to push it back up from the heart. Okay, so how does the conduction system work with the so part 1. Firstly, the oxygenated blood begins to fill the left atrium and the deoxygenated blood fills the right atrium. This is called atrial diastole, as it fills during relaxation. Then, as pressure builds up, 70% of the blood pushes through the bicuspid and tricuspid valve into the ventricles. Oxygenated blood goes to the left ventricle and deoxygenated goes into the right. The filling of the ventricles is known as ventricular diastole. 30% needs to be pushed through as there isn't enough pressure. The way it is pushed through is by contraction. So the SA node sends the impulse down the AV node, which allows the two valves to open, meaning the 30% of the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood is passed through to their ventricles. This is called atrial systole. So while this is happening, the SA node also keeps the pace of the impulse being sent, as it allows time for refilling and contraction. This is why it's known as the pacemaker. It also, just to note, the noise of your heartbeat is the valves opening and closing. The filling of the blood where there is no contraction is known as passive filling, as there's no contraction, whereas when there is contraction, the filling of the blood is known as active filling. So this is part 2 of the controlling. So once 100% of the blood has been contracted through the valves and into the ventricles, it is ready to be pushed back up and out of the heart. Firstly, the impulse from the AV is sent down the bundle of his, which is wrapped around the sternum of the heart. The impulse is then passed onto the Purkinje fibers. Once the impulse has been passed to there, it pushes both deoxygenated blood and oxygenated up their valves. Oxygenated blood goes up the aortic valve and deoxygenated blood goes up the pulmonary valve. The oxygenated blood then travels down the muscles where the oxygen is used at work and is filled with CO2. It then travels back up the right side as deoxygenated blood. The deoxygenated blood travels up to the lungs where it gains oxygen. This turns it into oxygenated blood and it travels back down to the left hand side and everything starts all over again. Okay, now we're going to look at the autonomic influence on the conduction system. This is just general. So before all of this, all of the conduction system, there's controls before. So in the brain, the medulla oblongata is the control center of the conduction system in the brain. Within that is the CCC, which is the cardiac control center. It starts all cardiac muscle impulse stimulation. This is all done with the autonomic nervous system, which controls and stimulates the muscle system involuntary. The CCC and the ANS controls two different types of system, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. That is the diagram of what the medulla oblongata is in the brain. So the autonomic influence on the CC, the parasympathetic nervous system. The PNS is the impulse to the pacemaker, the SA node, to slow down the heart rate. So first the CCC in the brain sends an impulse to the PNS. This impulse travels down what's known as the vagus nerve to the SA node. Just before the impulse reaches the SA node, there is a release of ACH, a neurotransmitter, which is a chemical. This inhibits the SA node from sending impulses, and this leads to a lower heart rate altogether. Next is the sympathetic nervous system. The SNS is the one that increases the heart rate. So once again, the CCC sends an impulse to the SNS. This impulse then travels down what's known as the accelerator nerve to the SA node. Just before it reaches the SA node, there is a release of a chemical called norepinephrine. This chemical causes the SA node to increase its tempo, in which increases the heart rate. It's also good to note that hormones can play a part, as adrenaline is a hormonal chemical stimuli that raises the heart rate as well. There's an example of adrenaline. Okay, so next up is the blood, and this is their structure and function. So the red blood cells, the erythrocytes in the blood, carry oxygen around the body. The white blood cells fight off infection and diseases to prevent our bodies from destroying our bodies. Next are the platelets. This is what clots wounds and cuts. This is what the scab is made out of. And then the last bit is plasma, which transports the blood cells and the platelets, which is like the watery liquid in our body. It's good to note that the percentage in our blood is 55% plasma and then 45% everything else. There's an example of a red blood cell, and there's an example of a white blood cell. Okay, so next up is the blood vessel structure and function. So first you've got venules, veins, capillaries, arterioles, and arteries. So first I'm going to start off with arteries. So first, in the structure, the wall has a thick muscular elastic tissue, a layer, to help it expand as blood goes through and to recoil after. This is because the blood is under high pressure and high velocity as it's just been ejected from the heart. The arteries are also controlled by the sympathetic nervous system with a thick muscular wall. So this is to help carry blood away from the heart. Next I'm going to move on to the arterioles. So it has tiny branches of arteries that lead to capillaries. This is important in controlling the distribution of blood. It's controlled by the sympathetic NS, as it transports blood from the arteries to the capillaries. The arterioles are able to vasoconstrict and vasodilate, and it's the main regulator of blood flow and pressure. The reason they are able to vasodilate is they dilate to reduce the BP and constrict to increase the BP. The BP stands for blood flow. Next I'm going to move on to the capillaries. So the capillaries have narrow blood vessels, 1 cell thick. This is so they are able to supply gas, nutrients and remove waste, so they don't prevent gases from coming in and out. The capillary beds also surround the organs. This helps with the